a shrouded horseman comes trotting into your nightly court. The mysterious rider then says to you, an honorable knight, that he would like to play a game. I would have you behead me, if then I may return the blow onto you. Would you accept my proposal? Would you play this game? My friend, bear in mind, a game can be a challenge, and a challenge can be a test merely waiting to be undertaken. Of course, it isn't in your nature to deny yourself a chance to prove your honor, and logic would have you believe such a blow could never be repaid. A dead man, a headless man, can never wield an axe, let alone, well, do anything. So, you agree. They show their neck, you raise the blade, and a head hits the floor. But a body doesn't. A hand unguided by eyes picks up its detached head, and the should-be lifeless mouth speaks, reminding you of the agreement. Now, it is their turn. So, Sir Knight, what is your next move? Do you stand by your promise and let the blow be returned onto you, choosing death before dishonor? Or is your word as a knight worthless, and you deny the challenger his return blow, choosing life over honor? This is the beheading game. This over 1,000-year-old dilemma is not one of reality, but more so one of legend, its purpose to determine pure chivalry. A rather extreme predicament for a courageous knight to find themselves in, yet one of the most effective ways to determine their merit. While the game has appeared as a common trope in a lot of medieval literature, two major tales truly stand out. One of Irish mythology, and the other, one of King Arthur's most famous tales. The latter of which is of course the critically acclaimed Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, certainly the most popular instance of the game being played. But the former is where we'll begin our journey, as it is the first time the beheading game tested a knight's resolve. This is Brick-Ryu's Feast, a very old Irish tale from the Ulster cycle, with roots in the 8th century. Without plunging too much into the weird depths of Irish mythology, we really only need to know who Brick-Ryu is in order to start this story. Brick-Ryu of the Evil Tongue is an infamous trickster. You may better understand him as the Irish Loki in a sense. He's cunning, quick-witted, and deceiving. His words are venom, and his deeds, poison. Nobody trusts him due to his never-ending shenanigans, but he possesses vast wealth and hosts a lavish party that he manipulates the upper class to attend, where he has no shortage of tricks to play. This is the setting for his most famous tale, the one telling of his feast. The mischievous and perhaps even malevolent troublemaker hosts this grand affair, so extravagant that it took a year to prepare. This was to be held at his newly constructed banquet hall, although palace might better illustrate its magnificence. You would not find a more gorgeous display of architecture in all of Ireland, and quite possibly in existence. Great pillars, exotic perfumes, fine furs and furniture, and an abundance of gold. A sanctum of comfort and luxury. For its most distinguished guest, a throne towering over the hall, crowned with cerulean sapphires, verdant emeralds, crimson rubies, and any flawless gem of blinding luster you could imagine. A stone rainbow shining so bright that the night was illuminated as if the morning sun had made an early appearance. This otherworldly wonder was so intricate, so grand, and so tantalizing in its design that it would be talked about for centuries to come. A banquet that all those of significance would have little choice but to indulge themselves fully in. That is, if this had been under normal circumstances. This was Brick-Ryu after all, and the nobles of Ulster and their king Concobar, for whom the feast was planned for, quickly turned away from the splendid affair when invited, wisely noting that whatever the trickster had scheduled would likely result in their dead outnumbering their living. This was enraging, and Brickryu threatened to turn son against father in a violent quarrel, then daughter against mother, and finally, should that fail, he turned women's breasts against one another in a duel to the death. The swindler was creative and quite possibly mad, but he was certainly capable of the deeds he promised. So reluctantly, the king agreed to attend as Brickryu's honored guest, but on condition that he would have the troublemaker escorted away from his own hall by armed guards after the feast was set, to keep his scheming words away from those in attendance. In this way, everyone there may actually enjoy their time. Of course, such an easy solution would not deter this master deceiver. His presence would not be required for his poisonous schemes to be. He may not reap the harvest, but he could still plant the seeds. Brickryu made sure to speak with the three greatest warriors underneath the king. These men were Conall Cernic, Luager the Victorious, and the esteemed Cuchulainn. He told them of the champion's portion, a select cut of the choicest meat traditionally reserved for the bravest man at the feast, a champion above all others. In this instance, the juiciest boar was butchered just for the occasion, fed its entire life with fresh milk, potent herbs, and the tastiest honey-baked treats. To wash this down was a vat of the finest wine, larger than the three men combined. This belonged to them. Not together, but only one man alone, as is custom with the champion's portion of any house. Brickryu had told each man individually, separate from their peers, that it should be theirs. They were the most deserving. Of course, disagreement occurred as soon as Brickryu was forcefully taken from the hall, and the feast underway. As the three champions reached for their promised portion, since there could only be one, and since warriors of this make were not the type to simply back down, each was ready to take up arms to prove themselves more deserving of that which was only entitled to the bravest and fiercest. It seemed as if Brickryu had succeeded, and Concobar's premonition had been proven correct, as there surely would have been spilt blood that night if wisdom had not prevailed. To avoid a full-out brawl, the champion's portion was decided to be split equally amongst all those present, but the three still desired to prove their claim. There was a time of eating, drinking, and boasting, but it was short-lived. Brickryu, angered by his plan being foiled, soon hatched a new one. When he saw the women approaching the feast, he got the attention of the three most beautiful, who also happened to be the three champions' wives. He played a similar game with them, telling them each individually that they must enter the hall first, as all other women should walk behind them. They would be queen of all. As expected, the three women each hastily tried to get inside first, racing against each other, resulting in the cluttering of the entrance and an argument between the champions' wives and their supporters, each woman giving a speech on why they were more divine. When the husbands noticed what was going on, the situation turned into the first of many contests. Luager and Conall Cernic broke the entryway's pillars in an attempt to clear a way in for their wives. But Cuchulainn, who is basically the Hercules of this story, lifted up the entire building, letting his wife in first, and thus they were the winning couple. The days following the feast included numerous contests, each feat of strength, bravery, and skill a victory for Cuchulainn. First, they traveled to Connacht to be judged by King Ailill and Queen Maeve. There, Cuchulainn was determined to be superior, but the others would not accept it. Thus, the competition continued on in Munster, where they were judged by the great Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn was a legendary king, almost godlike in his abilities. His judgment would surely be honored by all, but of course not. When he too declared Cuchulainn the victor and the worthy recipient of the champion's portion, the other two once again disagreed. However, a slight against the mythical Cuchulainn was not something the doubters should have taken so lightly. The trio wound back up in Ulster, yet the competition was far from over, as the biggest test came next. Whilst they were still bickering, one more test was laid before them, One final challenge to determine who deserves the champion's portion. One last game. It was a proposition from a churl, a hideous, reeking peasant, an insult to both sight and smell. The cloaked creature was also of giant stature and carried with him an appropriately oversized axe. He bluntly told each of them, "Today you shall cut off my head, and tomorrow I shall return for yours." The men must have thought this proposition impossible. The churl could never return the blow. Still, they were not ones to decline a challenge. As they underwent the ordeal separately, first up was Luiger. Although easily the weakest of the three, the churl's head fell in one fell swoop. Astonished he was, though, when the churl retrieved his severed head, bidding him farewell until tomorrow. When tomorrow came, the shaken warrior was nowhere to be found. Next up was Connell. Much mightier than the previous, but still not brave enough to face the troll's return blow the following day. The two showed cowardice. They chose life over honor. What use is the champion's portion if one's head is detached from their stomach? Cuchulainn, however, thought differently. Or perhaps he didn't think at all. It was just his nature. He cut through the troll's neck just as easily as the others. But when his time came for a return blow, he did not flee. Without so much as a tremble, he positioned his head for the axe to fall down upon. Twice the troll feinted the strike, as if testing the brave man's nerve. But on the third strike, the troll lifted the axe up high to the roof of the hall and brought it back down, but not in a swift chop, but in a gentle placement. "Rise," he told the champion, revealing himself to be the magical king, Ku-Ri, disguised in an effort to prove again his previous judgment. None now could question that the champion's portion belonged to Cuchulainn. Only he was brave enough to face certain death, as one could say glory was his true prize. Or maybe he just really wanted that pork. Either way, he was legendary. Brick Ryu's feast seems to draw a lot of inspiration from Celtic tradition and mythology, most notably the Gaels, who inhabited ancient Ireland. For one, the champion's portion, a common trope in early Irish tales, is likely based on old Celtic ideals. The choicest meat is reserved for the bravest man, and if more than one should step forward to claim it, then they must prove their worth, often in deathly duel. The champion's portion itself is a challenge in its own right, daring one to prove their desire and will. But this isn't the trope that we're focusing on. The beheading game, although entirely of legend, is also likely rooted in Celtic tradition, more specifically their fascination with severed heads. It was their belief that the head contained one's soul, and therefore, even after death, the head still lived on in some capacity, as the spirit remained. The worshipping of heads, or the cult of the severed head, as it's more colorfully known, is theorized to have been an immensely important religious aspect for the Celts, who are thought to have venerated the heads of loved ones and great leaders. The treatment of one's head could determine a lot about one's ultimate fate. Heads may be preserved so that ancestors may guide or watch over others, as they possessed prophetic abilities. Still, it wasn't always about honoring the dead. If the Romans are to be believed, then the Celts were also notorious headhunters. They would decapitate their enemies, embalm their heads, and hang them from their horse's neck or display them as trophies, making a prize of flesh and soul. The hero Cuchulainn even does this in another tale, as many of these Irish stories contain an abundance of beheadings. With this in mind, the beheading game has even more at stake, as well as deeper spiritual implications. Take, for example, the myth of Bran the Blessed. The Welsh sagas tell of this king of Britain. He was said to be gigantic, so large that he could not fit inside houses. Bran goes to war with Ireland to rescue his sister, and is mortally wounded in a bittersweet victory. He asks that his soldiers behead him and take his head back to Britain. For 80 years, the severed head talks and entertains them while they feast in the other world, until the bliss is ended and Bran's head ultimately laid to rest, facing France, where it protects Britain from invasion. After Christianity came to dominate the once pagan lands, the idea of a severed head continuing to live and speak remained, although it's unclear if these instances are related to the Celtic myths. Saints such as Denis and Eustace were decapitated, yet continued to live on, clutching their own severed heads in their hands, still capable of speech and prayer. Such saints are called cephalophores, those who lived on after death. Another notable beheaded saint is Winifred of Wales, who in particular is worth mentioning for later reasons. This 7th century Welsh martyr was a young woman wishing to devote her life to God. However, this would be denied to her when a suitor was angered by her refusal of his advances. He chased the fleeing Winifred and beheaded her. A healing spring emerged from the earth where her head fell. Due to the efforts of her uncle Saint Boino, her body and head were reunited, restoring her back to life with only a white scar around her neck remaining, as the suitor is said to have been engulfed by the very earth as it opened up around him. Winifred was then allowed to follow through on her devotion, living out her remaining days in peace. The spring that had emerged with healing properties is now a well, and remains a holy site in Wales. Another, much darker legend is that of the Headless Horseman. No, not the Sleepy Hollow version, but his predecessor. For the ancient Irish, he was known as the Dullahan, a harbinger of death. There are multiple versions of this mythical and demonic entity. You may see him as an undead rider, cloaked in pitch black. He is, of course, without his head, although he may be clutching it with a death grip by its clumped hair. The rotting, festering head is often compared to that of moldy cheese, smiling with an unnatural and sinister grin, as the soulless fire that is his eyes looks eagerly for his next victim. You may see him riding a black horse, lightning quick, as sparks fly when his hooves meet the ground. Or you may see him in his carriage. This macabre vehicle is made from tombstones, coffins, and human bones. Speaking of bones, watch out for his whip, made from the spine of an unfortunate soul, although you're unlikely to see it before he whips out your eyes with this unusual weapon. Still, the Dark Rider needs no whip, sword, or poison. He only needs the name of his victim and his cursing voice to unleash death. The very act of merely saying one's name enough to guarantee their fate. It's said that this ghoulish fiend is the very embodiment of the Celtic god Crom Corach, a pagan god once worshipped by kings, demanding human sacrifice in the form of decapitation. But thanks to St. Patrick and the spread of Christianity, this cruel god and his evil ways were forsaken. Still, he roams the roads, longing for that lost tribute. Now, while the legend of the Dullahan is not necessarily connected to that of the beheading game, it's worth noting, especially due to its similarities to another headless horseman we'll discuss later on. Now, let's get back on topic. Regardless of all the decapitations, headhunting, and mythical beings and spiritual beliefs that may have had some part in inspiring it, Brick Rayu's Feast is the beginning of the beheading game trope, a trend that would become a staple of medieval romance. However, it's outside of Ireland and Irish mythology where it really takes off. The following centuries see this impossible paradoxical challenge evolve into a dominating presence in Arthurian tales, usually as a means for one of King Arthur's knights to be tested. In this genre, many legends included an exchange of decapitations or blows. Things get more complicated here, as it seems many of these tales are based on each other or other Arthurian legends, rather than being directly inspired by Brick Rayu's Feast, although in the end they can be traced back to it. It's also important to remember that the beheading game is just one trope found in these stories. While it can be a major plot point, it isn't always the climax of the story. Now, although there's a lot more, there are 5 Arthurian romances that are really worth discussing here, 4 of which we'll just briefly cover. These old French and English tales seem to be independent of each other and follow their own lineage back to Brick-Rayu's feast. Perlisvas, Life of Caradoc, The Mule Without a Bridle, Honbot, and of course, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Perlisvas has Lancelot facing the challenge. This old French romance from the 13th century is a brutal one. The game here is done a little differently. Lancelot, often thought to be one of the noblest knights of the Round Table, finds himself in a ruined city, surrounded by a wasteland. Inside a seemingly destroyed and uninhabited city, a young knight faces execution. Lancelot is tasked with carrying it out. The young knight tells Lancelot to either take his place or to take his head, but should he choose the latter, he wants him to promise to return in a year's time to offer his own head. Lancelot reluctantly agrees to do as asked, beheading him and promising to come back in a year's time. After beheading the young knight, he looks behind him while leaving, only to see no head or body there, just hearing the cries of anguish and calls for revenge. Lancelot stays true to his word and returns the following year. At the same place at the same time, he puts his neck over the executioner's block as the fallen knight's brother prepares to carry out the sentence. Lancelot flinches and the first strike misses, but before he can strike again, 2 women call out for the brother to spare Lancelot, who recognized him from the year prior. Apparently, the axemen had lost many brothers in the same manner, and the executioners were always challenged to return. Yet, only the loyal Lancelot followed through on that promise. Instead of death, Lancelot is now given praise. The Life of Caradoc is a tale that's rather messed up. Caradoc, the son of a famous Welsh king, is sent to Arthur's court to become a knight of the Round Table. During the feast, after the knighting ceremony, a mysterious figure appears. It was a man cloaked in gray, riding a gray horse. He had a request for King Arthur and his knights, for the bravest of them to partake in a challenge. They will land a single blow onto his neck, and should the blow not kill him, he gets to repay it in a year. None wanted to take up this suspicious challenge, except Caradoc. The fearless newly knighted warrior easily beheads him. However, the cloaked man is not killed. Instead, his headless body picks up the severed head and reattaches it, reminding Caradoc of the rules. The year passes, Arthur is upset, his parents are upset, the knights are upset, but not Caradoc. He was determined to see it through. The cloaked man appears when the time comes, and Arthur offers him all the gold, silver, and jewels he has, as well as the armor of a knight. But this was refused. The only prize he wanted was Caradoc's head. Caradoc gave his neck to the cloaked man and prepared for his death, but when the sword was brought down on him, it wasn't with the sharp edge, but with the flat side, leaving the young knight unharmed. The reason for this might seem random if you don't read the full story, but in short, the cloaked man reveals that he is actually Caradoc's true father. He's a devious sorcerer that had bewitched Caradoc's parents, using his dark magic to secretly father him. After hearing this, an angered Caradoc sends him away, and the rest of this odd tale plays out. Both The Life of Caradoc and Perlisvas are continuations of the late 12th century Old French romance, Percival, the Story of the Grail. The Mule Without a Bridle, also known as The Damsel with the Mule, is among the oldest Arthurian romances to include the beheading game, possibly written in the late 12th century in Old French. Here Gawain takes up a quest to retrieve a woman's lost bridle for her mule. Gawain, Arthur's nephew and a knight of the Round Table, is the one most often playing the game, and a first ballot beheading game Hall of Famer. Along the way to retrieve the bridle, he encounters a large, ugly churl who challenges him. The usual "you behead me, I behead you, blah blah blah." Of course, the churl is beheaded and Gawain, upholding the agreement, then offers his own head. But for his bravery and loyalty, he is spared. He then continues on his quest to find and return the bridle to the maiden, a quest that is ultimately successful. Honbot is a romance from the 13th century. This work also sees Gawain as the knight being challenged, this time with a unique spin on both its champion and its outcome. Traveling with his companion, the knight Honbot, Gawain finds himself on a noble quest to collect taxes. The journey takes him far from home and places him in all sorts of danger. Honbot is like a voice of reason, while Gawain, in stark contrast to his character in most other stories, acts like a jackass. This is shown in how he handles ordeals, such as the beheading challenge, during his encounter with yet another large, ugly churl. The churl offers him the axe, as well as offers to exchange equal blows with it. Gawain doesn't hesitate in chopping the churl's head off cleanly. He was aware of the trick, however, and when the headless body leapt up to run after its head, Gawain seized it by the cloak, tearing it away, along with all the life that remained within it, as this piece of clothing was magical and kept the churl alive when worn. This story is unique as Gawain never offers his own head, and thus the churl never gets the opportunity for the return blow. These are the most famous depictions of the beheading game. While certain aspects may vary, the stories usually share common themes in regards to the game. Honorable knights, feasts, heroic journeys, large, ugly churls, enchanted cloaks, and the like. Most often the return blow is willingly offered, but it is never followed through on. Instead, their chivalry and loyalty is celebrated. They are never really in danger, but they don't know that, simply having to trust fate. It's just a game after all, but it does test what is more meaningful to the knight, their life or their honor. Will bravery and sportsmanship allow you to overcome the stunning revelation that the blow can indeed be repaid by a dead man? In terms of the beheading game, they all tell a similar tale with minor differences. Essentially a retelling of others, especially Brickryu's Feast, with a new setting and new characters. Now, deciphering which tale was directly inspired by which is a debated topic, complicated by questions such as which author knew of the other's work, and not to mention the added prospect of lost tales that helped introduce this Irish idea into medieval romance. A rabbit hole we're not going down today. For us, we'll just have to settle with the idea of Brickryu's Feast being the trunk, Celtic traditions being the roots, while these stories are like the limbs, branches, and twigs, all making up this tree of beheading games. Some are closer to its point of origin, while others are more akin to an offshoot of an offshoot. Now, of course, this metaphorical tree has one limb that stands out above the rest, one that's much more green. Without question, the most famous time the game has been played is in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This late 14th century romance was written by an unknown author and went centuries before it was given its name. An obscure work that has since become one of the most recognizable and influential of all Arthurian stories. While many of the tales we just covered are often criticized, this one is seen as a literary masterpiece, taking influence from Welsh, French, English, and Irish stories and traditions. Once again, Gawain is our hero, a knight of the Round Table and King Arthur's nephew. He is a young, honorable man wishing to prove himself. Our story begins in Camelot, at the court of the legendary King Arthur, where he and Queen Guinevere host a glorious celebration for Yuletide. For 15 days, lords, ladies, as well as the knights of the Round Table feast, exchange gifts, play games, and make merry. It's to be a new year after all. In fact, it's New Year's Eve when Arthur suggests a new game, one of several throughout this tale. He will refuse to eat his New Year's feast until he hears of an adventure. He wants to hear a fantastic story. But despite being surrounded by the noblest of knights in all of Logres, No one could tell one worthy of the king's ear. So he sat there while his dinner got cold, but as if a premonition, Arthur had foreshadowed the future of the young knight sitting next to him at the high table. Suddenly, all fell quiet and still, when an uninvited guest made their entry into the hall. A mysterious knight, green in skin and green in clothing, trotting towards the king on an equally green horse. Make no mistake though, this green physique was not ghoulish in appearance, but more so resembling the personification of springtime. He was quite handsome and of a very large build, large enough to ride his monstrous yet majestic steed. The knight's lush green hair and thick green beard were woven with golden threads, highlighting that he was someone of importance, even if not of this world. In fact, gold was a secondary color on his entire wardrobe, honeyed lines accenting the shades of green that made him look like the humanoid embodiment of a flourishing forest, with the brightest of sun rays shining onto the thriving flora. In his possession were two items. In one hand, he held a holly branch. He too enjoyed being festive. In the other, he held a magnificent axe, appearing as if a giant had forged it from green steel and pure gold. This Viridian and Orus man was almost mythical in makeup, like a warrior summoned by Mother Earth. He seemed to be a duality of two existences, one of nature and one of civilization. Ominous as all that may sound, the knight did not come for a fight. No, he too just wanted to play a game. With the attention of Arthur and all of his knights, he offered them a challenge. I will allow you to land a blow upon me with my own axe, and you may keep my axe, on condition that in 1 year and 1 day's time, the blow be repaid by me onto you. The room was void of any enthusiasm for this game. The hulking presence before them was incredibly intimidating, and the rules of his game were incredibly odd. With no volunteers and the Green Knight beginning to think these so-called legendary knights cowardly, Arthur prepares to take up the challenge himself. But just as he was about to pair this illustrious axe with the Excalibur in his royal armory, someone else broke the silence. It was Sir Gawain. He wished to try his hand at this peculiar game. Arthur, who was already mid-swing, relented and allowed this opportunity to pass on to his nephew. Strange, even for a green man, was when he bent down and lowered his neck, signaling for decapitation. The unproven Gawain raised the giant axe, and in one motion the blade collided with the knight's jade-colored skin, slicing through to the other side, emerging free through his throat, spewing red pigment onto the floor, as well as giving the knight the classic Christmas colors. Gawain had beheaded the Green Knight, but not killed him. The head had fallen, but the body had not. Instead, it was reaching to reclaim what was lost and rolling around the floor of the court. The Green Knight then held up his own severed head like a morbid lantern, aiming it towards the high table and a terrified Queen Guinevere in particular. The bleeding head spoke, reminding Gawain of the rules, and that a year from now, he must seek him out at the Green Chapel to uphold his end of the game. With that, the headless horseman rode off, his severed head laughing in his hand's strong grasp, like an evergreen devil riding back into his woodland hell. After that, the party soon resumed like all that didn't just happen. Arthur is now satisfied and can finally eat, as the great axe is hung up in the great hall. As the seasons pass and the new year draws close, an uneasy Gawain sets out on his journey, decked out in full armor, including his shield decorated with the pentacle that, among other things, symbolizes the chivalric virtues of piety, chastity, charity, companionship, and courtesy, which govern how Gawain acts. He is only accompanied by his trusty horse. The knight braves all sorts of ordeals in the wilderness. He fends off bears, boars, and bulls. He fights dragons, giants, and wild woodsmen, and he endures the harsh element of a frost-bitten landscape. He barely survives all of this just so he can go meet his death at the hands of the daunting Green Knight at the remote Green Chapel. Still Gawain presses on, determined to face whatever fate had in store for him, and to brave whatever the wild threw at him. Traveling through Wales and even by St. Winifred's holy well, the battle-worn and exhausted knight then prayed that he may find some guidance and aid, namely, a place to attend Mass on Christmas. As if divine intervention, he immediately saw an awe-inspiring castle. This was not the Green Chapel, but was like a warm oasis, offering escape from the unforgiving winter and wild. An enormous and tall building made entirely of white stone, a beacon of hope. Gawain was welcomed inside and met with generosity and hospitality. Those in the castle were honored to have one of King Arthur's famous knights as their guest, and he is quickly urged to make himself at home, eating and drinking to regain his strength. He is soon introduced to the lord of the castle, a man by the name of Bertilac, a middle-aged, burly man, strong in appearance, yet gentle in his speech and friendly in his demeanor. The kind lord then introduces Gawain to the two ladies who called this fortress home. One was his wife, the lovely lady of the castle, who was strikingly beautiful and wore an exposing but expensive dress made of colorful silk, in vivid contrast to the young, vibrant, and revealingly dressed lady was a nasty old hag who thankfully was much more clothed. In fact, her entire body and head were wrapped in fabric, leaving only her aged facial features being loosely unveiled. Gawain did not know who this elderly woman was, but it seemed she was well respected by all. He sees the two together like ends of a spectrum, life and death, the present and the future. Gawain thanks his hosts for taking him in, telling them of his destination and his nearing encounter at the Green Chapel mere days from now. Not wanting to miss his appointment, he says that he must be on his way soon, but the Lord countered with great news. The Green Chapel was just 2 miles away, being at the end of a nearby, easily accessible path. He asked that Gawain stay a while longer and continue to recover in his glorious home. To this, the knight is happy to accept. The Lord also has another proposition for Gawain: a game. The rules of this game are simple. The Lord, who will be going out each morning on a hunt, will give Gawain whatever he may catch that day, in exchange for whatever Gawain, who will be hanging out at the castle all day, may receive there. Gawain accepts this vague arrangement. On the first morning, the Lord, his party, and dogs go off hunting deer in the woods. Meanwhile, Gawain, who's still in bed, has a visitor. The Lord's wife, the lady of the castle, sneaks into his chamber and begins to act seductively, telling him that she prefers him to her husband, to which he disagrees. She keeps him trapped in his bed, where Gawain, remembering his chivalric virtues of chastity and courtesy, has to walk a fine line between not giving in to her advances, but also not offending her. He goes along with her playfulness, not to be discourteous, but won't go past that, as to not violate his chastity. Eventually, he gets her to leave, but she seems offended, calling him a fraud of a knight for letting her go without so much as a kiss. Not wishing to upset her, he gives her one kiss. That evening, the Lord returns with scores of venison, a champion's portion in its own right. The Lord gives what he has earned to Gawain, and Gawain does the same, kissing the Lord once. That's pretty sus, and the Lord asks where he received that gift from, but Gawain replies that disclosing how he obtains his spoils is not part of the rules. They laugh it off and go feast. The second day, the Lord once again leaves the young knight alone with his young wife, while he goes off hunting a boar. That day also brings more temptation to Gawain, as the lady once again visits his room. Her behavior is the same, and she playfully tries to convince the knight to give in. With his honor on the line, and likely not wanting to sleep with the lady's husband, he still refuses. This time, convincing her to leave only after she gets 2 kisses. That evening is much the same, the impressive boar's head for 2 kisses, then they feast. The third and final day, however, goes a bit differently. With the Lord off hunting a fox of a different sort hunts Gawain. The lady pays one last visit to Gawain's bedchamber. They talk for a while and exchange 3 kisses during the course of the conversation, but afterwards, she doesn't leave. She now asks something of Gawain, a token to show his love for her after he leaves. Having nothing of value to give her, he declines, so she instead offers to give him something, a ring, a priceless, precious, and prodigious ring crafted from pure gold and with dazzling gems. Gawain refuses this, unable to accept such an expensive gift while giving nothing in return. So the lady counters once more, offering her sash. This finely sewn girdle was green in cloth and gold in stitching, reminiscent of the Green Knight himself. This gift was much less valuable, but still the knight could not accept this. That is, until he heard of its magical properties. The lady tells Gawain that it has the ability to protect its wearer from any physical harm, including death. Now this was tempting. After all, tomorrow he could be walking up to his own execution. This might save his life. It's too much to turn down, and he accepts the lady's gift. He's found a perfect loophole he can exploit in the Green Knight's game. He can both live and uphold his end of the agreement. The blow is repaid, but he does not have to lose his head. Of course, this comes at the cost of cheating in the Lord's game of exchanges. In order to wear the sash tomorrow, he must be dishonest tonight about what he has received when gifts are exchanged. After giving him the sash, the lady asks that he hide this from her husband, keeping it a secret between the two of them, which, of course, Gawain agrees to. He attends Mass and confesses his sins, already praying to be forgiven. He receives absolution from the priest and goes about his day relieved. That evening the Lord returns with the fox pelt, giving it to the knight. Gawain, in turn, repays this with the 3 kisses he earned that day. However, he conceals the sash from the Lord, breaking his agreement. They all happily feast that night, and the next morning send Gawain on his way after he expresses his gratitude. A guide assists him on the path, and when nearing the Green Chapel offers advice. Turn back now, as no one survives a meeting with the Green Knight. The guide also says that he will not reveal his quest's abandonment to anyone. Gawain, however, refuses to leave. He will not be a coward. The guide then leaves the knight alone to face his adventure's conclusion, as he continues on with the sash tied around his waist. The Green Chapel was nothing like one might expect. There was no ethereal palace, no elegant display of trees and flowers, not even the chartreuse mystique one might expect for a supernatural haven in the wilderness. Instead, the Green Chapel in reality was entranced in an eerie aura. It was like death. There were no structures or sculptures. Instead, there was a mound, overgrown with grass, hiding a small dark cave. Just as Gawain was overcome with dread, thinking this place cursed, he heard a terrifying sound, the sharpening of a blade on a grindstone. After being called out of the crag by Gawain, the Green Knight emerged with another axe, impressed by the knight's timely arrival. It's now the moment of reckoning. One unhindered strike to the neck, a fair and equal exchange to close out the year-long covenant. Gawain lowers his neck, giving it for the repaying blow, prepared to die. The Green Knight lifted his axe into the air and brought it down hard, but froze suddenly. Gawain had flinched, and for this, his bravery was called into question, as the Green Knight mentions how he did not flinch when the roles were reversed. Ashamed, Gawain vows he will not flinch again. The second swing did not make him flinch, but once again was halted before reaching his flesh. as the Green Knight once more paused to speak, this time complimenting him instead of mocking. Gawain's shame now turned to irritation as he demanded the deed be done. On the third strike, the Green Knight once again brought the axe down with might, its sharp metal now piercing skin, but barely. He did not behead Gawain, but merely nicked the back of his neck. His plan seemingly worked and the debt had been repaid. The game was over. Gawain then unsheathed his sword, threatening the knight with a proper duel should he attempt another strike at him. To this, the Green Knight brushes off. He's not going to fight or harm him, but does say that he did indeed uphold his part of the game. However, there's a catch. The Green Knight then revealed his true identity. It was the Lord of the castle, and the entire thing had been a ruse. He tells of how both the beheading game and the one at the castle were intertwined. The first strike had been a feint because the exchange had been fair and honest, the deer for a kiss. The second was also a feint for the same reason, the boar for 2 kisses. However, the third strike, which proved the sash's lack of magic, nicked Gawain because he had not been honest. He gave 3 kisses for the fox, but concealed the sash from the Lord, cheating in the game. In reality, the Lord had sent his wife to test Gawain. The Green Knight praises Gawain, calling him faultless. He acted chivalrous throughout the whole thing, his only fault being that he wanted to live. The Lord also reveals that the entire charade was orchestrated by the old woman from the castle, who was actually none other than Morgan Le Fay, King Arthur's stepsister, and Gawain's aunt, who was a powerful sorceress. She appears in many stories, sometimes friend, sometimes foe, but always a magical force to be reckoned with. She had disguised the Lord as the Green Knight and designed the whole thing as a test for Arthur's knights, and had also hoped to scare Queen Guinevere to death in the process. This revelation was humbling for Gawain. He hated his deceitful decision and wished for the Lord's forgiveness, who then laughs, absolves him, and tells him to keep the sash as a reminder of his trial. He invites him to spend New Year's back at the castle, but a remorseful Gawain declines, opting to return home, now having the sash tied around him as a symbol of his sin and failure. The self-loathing Gawain tells this whole story to Arthur and the other knights back at court, who all believe he's much too hard on himself, but also respect his decision to continue to wear the girdle. The Round Table even decides to join him, each forever wearing a green sash, the same shade as the Green Knight himself, as a reminder to always remain chivalrous. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an incredibly detailed story with endless underlying meanings, many of which are still hotly debated amongst scholars. As for the beheading game, it differs quite significantly from its peers, as both the game itself and the hero playing it have additional elements. The challenge here is not what one might think, as it can be read as just an exchange of any blow, rather than only of beheadings. While the Green Knight does signal for it, the death blow is all the Christian Gawain seems to consider, while this alien, inhuman entity chooses mercy when it's his turn. Speaking of Gawain, he's not your flawless champion either. While heroes such as Cuchulainn are written to be infallible, Gawain is not. He's more relatable, more human. He flinches and he uses the sash to try and trick his way into survival, even though he does face the axe in the end, and he is chivalrous for the most part. He is not perfect. Perhaps this is best seen in the flaws of his mentality, or rather, the mentality of knighthood. He lives by the virtues illustrated on his shield, and when they are challenged, such as when the lady tempts him in regards to chastity and courtesy, his entire way of life is called into question. The test of temptation is another common theme in these stories, but here it plays a vital role. As the lady tests Gawain, his chastity and courtesy keep him in line, not being seduced nor being rude. But when this enchanted sash is introduced, offering him the hope of survival, he gives in. It's like a forbidden pagan magic, giving him the continued life his values try to deny him. Accepting this gift is bad enough for the knight, but lying about it to the Lord is his greatest sin. While he may technically succeed in the beheading game, the game of exchanges he fails in. The blows were exchanged equally with the Green Knight, but the gifts were not with the Lord. Despite this decision on Gawain's part, the Lord, who is of course the Green Knight, tells Gawain he is faultless. He has nothing but praise for him. Perhaps because he understands Gawain's struggle. The code he lives by is not without flaw, but even so, Gawain takes this trial to heart and vows to be a better knight. The beheading game did not prove his chivalry like it does in other tales, but rather it gave him the desire to achieve it. In the end, these stories are all about testing the champion's honor. The churl and the Green Knight feint their strikes, never actually giving the same blow, and the Green Knight only nicks Gawain on the third strike because of his dishonesty in the game of exchanges, proving that the sash was not magical. Gawain's trial is much deeper than most, testing him not just to see if he is chivalrous, but also what that truly means to be so. We've seen the game evolve from its simple inclusion in Brick Ryu's Feast to the more complicated one in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. All these tales involve very similar themes, such as the unexpected resurrection of the challenger, their lack of a repaid beheading, and the mysterious challenger being a sorcerer in disguise. It's a surprisingly deep medieval romance trope for a time when chivalry was supposed to be of the utmost importance to a knight. This exchanging of blows represents an interesting what-if scenario, a game with everything at stake, as their neck is literally on the line, a choice between death and chivalry. Personally, I think we'll just stick to cornhole at my next cookout. Thanks for watching.